Leafcutter ants. They can be found in almost every habitat in the New World, stretching from New York to southern Argentina, from the harsh deserts of Arizona to the wet jungles of Brazil. They are also by far my favorite ants of all time, and I've devoted a significant portion of my life to keeping and observing fungus-growing ants in captivity and the wild for the past several years. In this video, I will aim to cover absolutely every aspect of keeping these ants, all of which I've learned through over 5 years of experience with over 20 species of fungus-growing ants in both captivity and the wild. After watching this video in its entirety, you should be fully equipped to keep almost any colony of fungus-growing ants you can dream of in the best way possible. For ease of watching, since this video will likely end up being rather long, I have broken it up into chapters. I'm not expecting everyone to watch everything in one sitting, so if you need to take a break from the video and come back later, hopefully these chapters will make everything easier to navigate. I would, however, recommend watching this video in its entirety before keeping fungus-growing ants, even if you choose not to watch it all in one sitting. Before anything, I'd like to give a bit of categorization to the various species and genera of fungus-growing ants. While there are many similarities to the care of these ants across the board, certain genera will have specific care requirements that are crucial to understand. Of course, this guide aims to cover every minute detail of every species possible, so fear not. Absolutely all of the information you will need is right here in this video. To start our categorization, let's take a look at some basic fungus grower phylogeny. It's okay if you don't really understand what this all means. What is important are just the various categories. Higher Attines are often considered the more sophisticated fungus growers. These have the most standard care, with almost every species having relatively generalistic nesting requirements and diets. This group is broken up into two subgroups, those in the quote leafcutter ant clade, and those outside of the leafcutter ant clade. Honestly, I don't know where they get off calling themselves the leafcutter clade, but hey, I didn't choose the name. This name can also be a bit misleading, and I generally don't like it, as all higher Attines and even a lot of lower Attines do cut leaves, making them leafcutter ants, as in ants who cut leaves. Let's call this clade the highest Attines instead. A much more fitting title, if you ask me. The highest Attines are made up of 3 genera, Atta, Acromyrmex, and Cyphomyrmex. These genera have polymorphic workers and create large colonies, with Acromyrmex and Cyphomyrmex reaching tens of thousands to over 100,000 workers, and all Atta species exceeding 1 million workers at full size. Most of the species have long legs used for climbing trees, and as such are very good at escaping. Later, I'll detail exactly how to ensure these guys stay contained in their setups. One notable species here is Acromyrmex versicolor, a commonly kept species from the deserts of North America that has some unique care requirements compared to the rest of the highest Attines. Within this clade, the guide will primarily be focusing on Atta and Acromyrmex, as Cyphomyrmex is rarely kept, although there will be a few notes on this genus in their respective section. All other fungus-growing ants are not polymorphic, and have relatively small colony sizes, rarely surpassing 1,000 workers. This may make them less exciting to keep for some, but small colonies are easily manageable for those with less time or resources to dedicate to a single colony. The lower Attines are a significantly more interesting bunch. The distinction between those in the Paleo-Attina clade and those outside of the clade is much less dramatic than found in higher Attines with the highest Attines, at least when it comes to their care in captivity. This is because lower Attines are much more unique between genera. Rarely can care be generalized across genera, and each genus will have unique care. Even certain genera have many individual species with unique care requirements. Due to how many species of lower Attines there are and how rarely kept they are, this guide will only have a strong focus on those species that are commonly kept, notably a few Cyphomyrmex species. However, there will be notes on as many genera as possible. Before we move on to the main part of the guide, you need to know about the golden rule of fungus growers. Heat kills. For almost all species, I consider the absolute upper limit to be around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, although some species, such as Acromyrmex versicolor, prefer slightly higher temperatures and can be pushed as high as 90. Still, I would never recommend letting your fungus growers exceed 83 degrees Fahrenheit. If you live somewhere cold, note that heat kills much faster than cold, even for tropical species, and when heating, you must be extremely careful not to overdo it. For reference, my previous Atta mexicana colony, which at the time had around 50,000 workers, completely died after 4 days at 87 degrees. The fungus especially is highly susceptible to high temperatures. Most of the highest Attines, especially Atta, nest multiple feet underground to insulate their fungus from the heat, and this should be respected in captivity. The most ideal temperatures are typically between 70 and 80 degrees, so try to manage your colonies somewhere in this range, with extreme care not to exceed the upper limit. Another mistake I often see related to this problem has to do with the sun. Placing colonies in direct sunlight can very easily cause a greenhouse effect inside the fungus chamber, causing the air inside to heat up dramatically, frying the colony. I personally know several keepers who have lost Atta colonies to this exact thing, so please keep your fungus growers away from the windows. With that out of the way, let's start our guide by looking at colony foundation. Fungus-growing ant queens start their fungus garden from a small pellet kept in a pouch in their mouthparts known as the buccal pouch. From there, they will spit a buccal pellet into their founding chamber and begin caring for it, feeding it until it grows into a full-fledged fungus garden. Every fungus grower except Atta have semi-claustral queens, meaning they must forage for plant material to feed their founding fungus. Atta, on the other hand, are fully claustral. That's part of why they're so dang thick. Anyways. This buccal pellet is quite literally the most important thing. If it dies, or if you catch a queen who has already dropped hers, you will need to source fungus from another colony to donate to your queen, which in all likelihood will be quite difficult. Thankfully, many fungus growers will gladly tend to the fungus of other species, so replacing lost fungus can be easy in certain cases. As a generalization, taking fungus from closely related species or genera has the highest chance of working. For example, highest Attines will generally only tend to other highest Attine fungus. Generally, higher Attines cannot tend to lower Attine fungus. For best results, taking donor fungus from the same species or the same genus is the most ideal. To ensure you're collecting a queen who still has her buccal pellet, you'll need to be there for the nuptial flight. The best time to collect queens is typically within 2 hours of them taking off from their home colony. The first step, though, is to make sure your queens are fertile, and you're not collecting unmated queens. In some species, this is rather easy. Acromyrmex versicolor form large, noticeable swarms, and will very gladly mate on the ground. Once elates are in flight, males will latch onto a queen, fall to the ground, and mate. Queen and male elates can be picked up from the ground, placed in a container, and they will mate, making getting fertile queens an easy task. The same applies for many Trachymyrmex species, and likely many other species from various genera. For some species, such as all Atta species, you will need to wait for the queens to mate in the air, drop their wings, and begin looking for a suitable spot to dig their founding chambers. These mate in the air and will not mate on the ground or in a container, so collecting males and virgin queens together is pointless. Be on the lookout for queens that have already shed their wings and are wandering around. For all species of fungus growers, it is important to collect queens that have not yet begun digging their founding chamber. This ensures the highest chance that your queen is still carrying her buccal pellet. When collecting queens, it's a good idea to place them directly into the container you plan to use for founding, so that there's no chance of her accidentally dropping her pellet in a random collection container. Collecting queens that are already digging a founding chamber, or digging queens out of a founding chamber is fine if you have a way to donate fungus to them, as queens that have already begun digging a founding chamber have a very high chance of being fertile. But if you need fungus, try to target queens that have not yet started digging. For most species, a deli cup with 1 to 2 centimeters of plaster at the bottom is a perfect setup to start your queens in. The type of plaster here doesn't matter much, but generally I'd recommend using a gypsum cement that's tough and absorbs water well. UltraCal 30 is my go-to, as it's very hard when it cures and has decent absorption. Plaster of Paris is not generally recommended, as it's quite soft and susceptible to growing mold. However, it's not a terrible option for a founding cup, since we'll be moving the ants to a more permanent setup later. In a pinch, almost any kind of plaster can work in this stage, as long as it absorbs water. I would not ever recommend using a test tube setup for fungus growers. If using cotton, it can be susceptible to harmful mold growth, and even if using PVA sponges, the ants can chew up the sponges, causing flooding or causing the sponge to land on the fungus, causing harm. Tubes are also generally too cramped for fungus-growing ants to grow good fungus. Overall, I would always recommend a deli cup or a small founding-size formicarium. I'll discuss how to create a formicarium later, but for now, let's look into that deli cup setup a little bit more. A deli cup founding setup is cheap and easy to produce, making it easy to create dozens of setups for catching plenty of queens. Adjust the size of the deli cup based on species size, greater than 4 ounces for Atta and 4 ounces or smaller for everything else. Once your queen is in her founding chamber, check for fungus during the first 48 hours. The fungal pellet will be small and brown for the first few hours after it's placed down, but will quickly become white and fuzzy. At this point, food can start being offered to all queens of the semiclaustral genera. For Atta, it's important not to disturb queens with too many vibrations, as they can be quite sensitive in founding. Founding Atta queens are also incredibly sensitive to light, and chances of queen death increase significantly when queens are left in the light. Keeping queens in a dark, vibration-free place gives the best chances for founding. If no fungus is visible in the first 48 to 72 hours, begin searching for a way to boost them, whether it be another local keeper that keeps fungus-growing ants, taking fungus from another one of your colonies, or something else. Without fungus, your queen's life is in danger. Longer than 1 week without fungus puts your queen at a dramatically higher risk of death, and for a fully claustral Atta queen, longer than 1 week may leave her without the necessary resources to raise her first generation of brood. Speaking of raising her first generation, once you've confirmed that your queen does in fact have fungus, you'll need to provide her the right conditions to raise it as well as possible. For Atta, this is as easy as leaving your queens in a dark, quiet, vibration-free place for a few weeks, checking once a week or so to ensure your cups are still humid and adding a bit of water if necessary. Be sure not to overwater. If the plaster cannot absorb all the water and is visually wet, the setup is too wet and can kill the fungus. Move the queen to a drier cup immediately. This hydration tip will apply for all species through all stages of life. A flooded chamber can be deadly and must be addressed immediately. For semiclaustral species, food items will need to be offered. These can be placed directly in the founding chamber, or a foraging area can be connected. A foraging area should be small and completely sealed to ensure the humidity in the main chamber is kept high, and to reduce airflow that could stress the queen. If choosing to feed in a foraging area, drill a small hole into the founding chamber and use a short length of tubing to connect to the foraging area. Alternatively, the founding cup could be placed directly inside of a foraging container, although I personally don't prefer this method. One advantage to using a foraging area is that the setup can be usable for longer after the nanoticks arrive, as the workers will simply use the foraging area to continue growing the fungus. The alternative method is to not include a foraging area, and to simply place food directly inside the nest. This can improve feeding responses, however unused plant material will begin to grow mold quickly in a humid environment, so it's recommended to remove old plant material no more than 24 hours after offering it. This method is a bit more work because of that, but is my overall preferred method. Note that semiclaustral queens are much less susceptible to stress than Atta queens, so checking your queens daily is not a big concern. As for ideal food items, I would generally recommend flowers, although it's important to offer a wide variety to see what your queen likes best. Each individual queen will have different preferences, and while members of the same species will generally have similar preferences, every queen can differ. Don't be discouraged if your queen is refusing food, just try more variety. Rose petals and lettuce can be a consistent option, as generally across species and genera, these seem to be well received. As your colony grows, they will get less picky, so don't be discouraged if your queen seems to only eat 1 or 2 foods. it's likely that her workers will have a broader palate later in the colony's life. If using a foraging area, dry food items like oats, cornmeal, and corn polenta can also be solid options, although possibly less consistent for Acromyrmex and Ammoymyrmex queens. Ammoymyrmex are also known to feed on grasses more than flowers and leaves, although they have been documented to be opportunistic. If you're having trouble getting them to accept plants, be sure to try offering grasses. Another tip if you're having trouble getting your queens to eat is that plants not native to the New World are often preferred by fungus-growing ants. This is because many New World plants have developed resistances to fungus-growing ants, but Old World plants lack these resistances. When collecting queens, it's important to collect more queens than you think you'll want, since deaths in founding can be common. Especially in Atta, where founding is very hands-off, it's common and often unavoidable to experience a high death rate among founding queens. For semiclaustral species, random deaths in founding are far less common, but can still happen. Some species will found cooperatively, where many queens will work together. This is known as Pleometrosis. In species where this happens, it's generally a good idea to put multiple queens together, as many queens working together has many benefits. Many buccal pellets being placed down gives a higher chance of one surviving, and more queens collecting plant material can grow a fungus garden faster. Acromyrmex versicolor, and most outside the highest Attines, will found cooperatively, though most of these species participate in secondary monogeny. During founding, multiple queens will work together, however, after workers arrive, they will cull off all but one queen. To prevent this, queens should be separated into their own setups shortly after workers arrive. Now I know what you may be thinking. Tyler, I collected 95 queens in this nuptial flight. How the heck am I going to take care of 95 colonies? I'll just let them cull down to one and keep the best queens. And this is not particularly flawed, other than the fact that the queens themselves will often fight, leaving the surviving queen with missing legs, missing antennae, or sometimes there won't be a surviving queen at all. At the very least, make sure that you set aside a queen with a good chunk of fungus and workers to keep for yourself. Also, when splitting up queens in general, definitely make sure you give them fungus and workers. I figured that would be obvious, but I'll just say it to make sure. The main exceptions to this rule are Acromyrmex versicolor from certain areas around Tucson, Arizona, Trachymyrmex septentrionalis from certain localities, especially northern populations, and Atta texana. These species, unlike most other fungus growers, will tolerate multiple egg-laying queens in a colony for the entire lifespan of the colony. These are not necessarily the only exceptions, but they are by far the most commonly kept species that will tolerate multiple queens. Most semiclaustral queens will produce a small first generation of workers, especially if they found alone without the help of other queens. I would generally recommend to keep care the same post-founding until the colony gets at least a few dozen workers. Atta, on the other hand, will raise a first generation of 30 to 50 workers, who will begin looking to cut plant material almost instantly, even though many of the first workers produced in Atta will be tiny minims. At this point, either moving the colony to a more permanent setup with a foraging area, or just attaching a foraging area to their founding cup is ideal. I generally do not recommend feeding Atta inside their founding chamber, although it certainly can be done for a short while after the first workers arrive. The final founding notes pertain to Atta. Firstly, with Atta texana, research has shown that groups of 3 to 6 queens have the highest chance of not only succeeding in colony foundation, but staying stable later into the colony's lifespan. If during founding a few queens die, additional queens can be added at any time before workers arrive. More than 6 queens may not be recommended, as it's possible the workers will become aggressive to queens after founding if there are too many. This is also true for polygynous Acromyrmex versicolor populations. For them, 3 to 8 queens seems to be the sweet spot, and staying towards the lower end of that will reduce risk of worker-queen aggression later in the colony's life. With Atta texana and mexicana, it's possible to skip the founding stage. This is risky, but is high reward if it pays off. It has been proven that with these two species, and very possibly other Atta species as well, newly mated queens and foreign workers will not fight, and can merge to form a colony. This means that a newly mated queen can be introduced to a group of workers, and they will begin to work for her. If choosing to found your colony with this method, be extremely careful. Watch for any signs of aggression between the queen and workers, and be ready to remove any workers that show aggression towards the queens. This strategy is not guaranteed to work, but if it does, it basically eliminates the founding stage, where queens are most likely to die for no reason. If you choose to do this strategy, go all in and boost with a large number of workers. 50 or more is ideal, but absolutely no less than 15. This is so that they will begin cutting plant material in large numbers right away, allowing the fungus to grow fast. If too few workers are added, they may not cut, and the colony will fail. This strategy is significantly more likely to work if you introduce the founding queen to fungus from the same colony as the foreign workers, but this can be difficult if you or a friend don't already have an Atta colony, and you need to take workers from the wild. Once your colony has around 15 to 30 workers, if you haven't already, it's time to add a foraging area, and consider moving your colony to a new setup. This is the part where the care will need to be adjusted a little more to pertain to the specific species you're keeping. But before I split the video into specifics, I'll go into the general concept for a nesting chamber, as it'll be very similar for effectively every species. You'll want to start with a nice acrylic container. The ideal size will depend on what you're keeping, so we'll get into that later. This setup will be very simple. Similar to your founding setup, a layer of plaster on the bottom will be used to hold humidity. Also similarly to the founding setup, a plaster that is hard and absorbent is crucial here. Using something soft like plaster of Paris is a terrible idea, as the ants will chew into the plaster and destroy it, effectively ruining the setup. Once again, UltraCal 30 is by far my favorite option, as it's hard, absorbent, and as a bonus, it expands minimally during curing, meaning it won't crack your acrylic containers. Start by creating some method to hydrate your plaster. My two favorite options are to either use sand to create a chamber under the plaster, or to create a small hole in the lid to drip water directly onto the surface of the plaster with a syringe. This option can be a bit tougher to create with no tools, as melting a mesh screen over the hole to prevent escapes is pretty important. Securing this mesh with glue could result in the ants chewing through the glue and escaping. I usually use a soldering iron to melt the mesh into the lid. If using the sand chamber method, use a drill or soldering iron to punch a small hole into the container towards the bottom. Be careful doing this. It's easy to burn yourself with a hot soldering iron, and it can be easy to accidentally destroy a container with a drill. A soldering iron will generally make cleaner holes in acrylic and is my preferred method. Once you have your hole, pour sand into the container, filling it to just above the top of the hole. You will likely need to tape over the hole to keep the sand contained. Once your hydration system is done, mix up a batch of plaster and pour. Ultimately, your plaster layer shouldn't be too thick. If you're using a sand chamber, pour until the plaster layer is about 1 centimeter above the height of the sand chamber. If not, just pour approximately 2 to 3 centimeters of plaster into the container. Once your plaster is poured and cured, the last step is to just create a hole for a foraging chamber, and optionally a second hole for attaching additional nesting chambers. This basic nesting concept, with a few changes to the size of the container, will work for effectively every species of fungus-growing ant. One final note is that this setup can be improved a bit. When fungus directly touches a saturated surface, it will die a bit faster. Fungus does naturally die. As it grows upwards, the sections towards the bottom, which are generally the oldest, will die and be discarded. This generally isn't a concern, as a colony will always grow their fungus dramatically faster than even this slightly increased dying rate. However, wild colonies often have methods to avoid their fungus directly touching wet soil, whether it's leaving gravel at the bottom of the chamber, nesting in sandy, well-draining soil, hanging the fungus from the ceiling, or even a combination of all three. It's clearly ideal to have the fungus suspended in some way. While I typically don't choose to do this, as it's really not a huge deal, my favorite method so far has been to use a 3D printed mesh that the fungus can rest on top of. This is a similar concept to what's seen in the Wakushi fungus pod, but honestly I struggle to recommend that product. I've never personally used it, but I have seen it misused far too many times, and by looking at it, I can easily get an idea of how it's intended to work. In my opinion, it's simply overpriced and over-engineered. It's also far too large for most species. It should only be reserved for highest Attine colonies that are well past the incipient stage. This is part of it being misused. I almost always see it being used on incipient Atta colonies, and it is far too large of a setup for colonies of those sizes. Ultimately though, I can't find anything particularly wrong or bad about the product, and it should work well in theory for the right-sized colony. Still, the format I just described for creating a DIY nest is simple, effective, and inexpensive, and I personally wouldn't recommend using any other kind of setup. Now that we have an idea on what a general nesting space is supposed to look like, we'll need to get into some more specifics. Let's start with Trachymyrmex, Trachymyrmex, Mycetomilarius, Xeroliter, and Cyphomyrmex. These genera, as a full-sized colony, will typically grow at most around half a liter of fungus, with some larger species such as Mycetomilarius jamaicensis and Trachymyrmex smithii possibly exceeding 1 liter. For most species, that translates to a volume of about 32 cubic inches or 500 cubic centimeters. A bit of extra space in the nesting chamber can't hurt, but going too overboard is generally a bad idea, as it could lead to trash being stored inside the nesting chamber and generally unsanitary conditions. For US keepers, I really like the 115C or 033C containers from Pioneer Plastics. These can be found on Amazon, each have a volume just under half a liter, and look great. Any similar containers could work, these are just my personal favorites. If your colony grows exceptionally large, 2 of these containers can be used for the colony to grow 2 separate fungus chambers. Now, I want it to be clear, I have no direct affiliation with them, but Pioneer Plastics has been an ant-keeping staple in both hobby and lab applications for decades. They're really good containers, although I have noticed as of late their quality has slipped a little bit. Still, you'll hear some container recommendations from them later in this guide. Of course, no matter what container you choose, nests for these species should be set up with plaster and hydration in exactly the same way as detailed in the previous section. For a foraging area, any traditional outworld works great. These species do not produce enough waste to warrant a designated trash chamber, and they'll have no problem dumping in a normal outworld. Waste will primarily consist of dead fungus and dead workers, and should be cleaned semi-regularly, although it won't stack up too quickly, as these species with smaller colonies generally produce waste slowly. Their workers have long lifespans, and a small fungus garden won't be producing very much dead fungus consistently, so trash maintenance for these guys is overall pretty low. Other than that, the foraging area should be large enough to place a few large flowers, leaves, and other food material in there for them to forage on. This outworld can either be open with a barrier such as fluon, or have a lid with ventilation. If using a barrier with no lid, the nesting chamber will dry out slightly faster due to the increased airflow, so keep that in mind. Thankfully, that's just about all there is for setup requirements. They're quite easy, and I generally consider them a great start for beginners. It's also worth noting that the species in this group from more arid habitats, such as most Trachymyrmex species and Mycetomilarius turrifex, their fungus will likely be more resistant to desiccation, and thus they'll be a little more forgiving if you forget to water them, giving you more crucial hours to notice the damage and rehydrate the setup before catastrophic damage happens. This may not be true for the few Trachymyrmex from wetter habitat, such as Trachymyrmex septentrionalis and Trachymyrmex sauceri. Even then, I've observed Trachymyrmex sauceri with their fungus at the surface during the height of the dry season, where the soil was notably dry, so they may still have some drought-resistant traits. Moving on from their housing, these genera will all have a relatively similar diet to each other. Being higher Attines, their typical diet will consist of a notable amount of fresh plant material, but they will also readily take other food items as well. For plants, generally the easier these are for the ants to cut, the better. Flowers, small leaves, and similar items. Every species and every individual colony will have different preferences for specific food items, so experiment with the local plants from your area and see what they like. If you're struggling to get your colony to eat, certain plants such as rose petals and lettuce are often taken by a majority of species and colonies within and outside of this group, and are certainly worth a shot. It's also a good idea to offer a varied diet, as the same food offered over and over may eventually be rejected. That said, this behavior is most prominent in the highest Attines, so it may not be as much of an issue for those lesser fungus-growing ants. As for food items that aren't fresh plants, I've had consistent success with steel-cut oats, cornmeal, corn polenta, and caterpillar frass. Some of you may have heard a long-standing myth that species such as Trachymyrmex septentrionalis are primarily frass eaters, but this is simply not true. All species in this group will readily consume fresh and dried plant material. They may not be leafcutter ants in name, but they are still ants who cut leaves, and should be treated as such. The final note on this group has to do more specifically with some of the Trachymyrmex species, as well as possibly Mycetomilarius turrifex. Species from colder climates will almost always require a diapause period, also colloquially known as hibernation. During the winter, they will need to be cooled down to around 45 to 53 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 2 to 3 months. The ants themselves will let you know when they're ready for this, as they will shrink their fungus down to just a few small pellets beforehand. If you notice your Trachymyrmex dismantling large amounts of fungus, refusing to cut leaves, and not producing brood during the winter, don't panic. Once they've shrunk their fungus down to just a few small pellets, small enough for an individual worker to carry around, it's time for sleep. Cool their entire setup down to between 45 and 53 degrees, preferably around the middle of that range, and leave them for about 2 to 3 months. Species from warmer climates, such as Trachymyrmex septentrionalis from the south, western Trachymyrmex species, and Mycetomilarius turrifex should be diapaused at warmer temperatures, and may even diapause properly at room temperature in a cool room. Ensure the setup stays hydrated during this time, although note at cooler temperatures, the chamber may dry out slower than during the colony's active period. After diapause, bring your colony back into a warm place and begin feeding again, and you should notice the fungus quickly growing back to the size it was before winter. Oh, the highest Attines. Atta, Acromyrmex, and Amymyrmex. I'm gonna assume that a majority of you watching this video are here for Atta and Acromyrmex. I don't blame you. With these species being relatively common in the European ant trade, widespread through the New World, and often very sought after due to their awesome traits like producing large soldiers and making large colonies, it's no surprise that these genera are by far the most commonly kept fungus growers. I would generally consider these guys to be pretty straightforward in terms of their care. However, I often see keepers making very questionable decisions with their colonies, and one of the main goals of this guide is to address many of the creative decisions I see people making with their leafcutter ants. For starters, though, there's one species in particular I'd like to discuss before all the rest, that being Acromyrmex versicolor. This species is quite possibly the most unique of the highest Attines, having made many interesting adaptations to be able to survive in some of North America's harshest deserts. It's also one of the most commonly kept species, at least here in the US, so I find it very important to detail their care as thoroughly as possible. One thing you may have noticed with this species from the footage on screen is that their fungus grows very strangely when compared to basically every other higher Attine. Instead of creating a garden that grows upwards from the floor with a very comb-like structure, these ants instead create long strands of fungus that hang down from the ceiling. The reason for this is that the deserts they live in are often prone to spontaneous, heavy rainstorms, and the dry desert soil often can't absorb the water fast enough, causing heavy runoff and flooding. To prevent the fungus from getting saturated in heavy storms, it hangs from the ceiling over a bed of gravel, allowing for more efficient drainage and a physical buffer between the ants and the floor of the chamber. It's a pretty genius little strategy, and while flooding may not be a concern in captivity, we must account for this behavior when keeping this species. To allow these ants to hang their fungus properly, a thin nesting chamber is ideal. For a small colony, a chamber depth of around 1 inch is ideal, and this should be increased to a maximum of about 3 inches for a larger colony. In the wild, a mature colony will create a dome-shaped chamber with a diameter of 8 to 12 inches and a maximum height of around 3 inches. Very large colonies may create 2 of these chambers. These dimensions should be replicated as accurately as possible in captivity to ensure a healthy colony. While a dome shape isn't necessary, keeping in mind the maximum height of around 3 inches is critical. If you notice your colony hanging fungus from the walls of the chamber, or even growing it upwards from the floor, consider moving them to a setup with a shorter chamber height. While the ants can grow fungus when it's hanging from the wall or growing up from the floor, they grow the best, healthiest fungus when it's hanging from the ceiling. It is worth noting that it's possible for a chamber to be too thin. Going under about 15 millimeters for a small colony and under about 1.5 inches for a large colony is typically not going to give the colony enough volume to grow good fungus, and ultimately the chamber will be too cramped. Also with Acromyrmex versicolor, you must allow the colony to move on their own, at least post-founding. Once the colony gets around 10 workers, they can be manually transferred from their founding cup to a starter setup. Usually for this, I like to set up a thin container, like a petri dish, using the methods described previously. You've seen plenty of this style of setup so far. Queens can also found in this style of nest, if you'd prefer to skip the deli cup altogether. Although if you're catching a lot of queens, it can be quite costly to purchase or make a large number of these starter formicaria. After the colony's in this starter formicarium, they should absolutely, under no circumstances, be manually moved. For whatever reason, if a colony is picked up and moved to a new setup forcefully, it often creates massive infighting, where the workers will ruthlessly attack each other and their queen, causing mass casualties and potentially entire colony death. To avoid this, absolutely never, ever, 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 ever move the colony manually. Instead, attach a new nesting chamber to their setup and keep it moistened while allowing the old chamber to dry out. The colony will begin growing new fungus in the new chamber, and over time will vacate the old dry chamber. If the colony's being stubborn about growing fungus in the new chamber, keep the old one moist, and once it fills up completely, they should begin using the new one, since they've run out of space to grow their fungus elsewhere. At this point, you can start to let the old setup dry out. Now that they've identified the new space as suitable nesting, they should move over quickly. It's also worth noting that if they're being particularly stubborn, there's a chance that the 2 chambers are too far away, and you should shorten the physical distance between these chambers. Another unique characteristic of this species is their stubby little legs. Unlike effectively every other species of highest Attine, Acromyrmex versicolor has short legs that are adapted for foraging on the ground and low-hanging branches, very similar to the workers of the other higher Attine genera we discussed previously. This, combined with the fact that their native desert habitat generally lacks trees with broad leaves, means that they'll generally refuse many larger leaves, and instead prefer a diet of primarily flowers and small leaves, such as those from mesquite trees. They also like to dry out their food before consuming it, so if you see your colony cutting up flowers and just piling them outside their nest entrance, don't worry, this is totally normal, and you should see them beginning to bring that plant material inside the nest after a day or 2. That said, if they're placing plant material directly in the trash, chances are they don't want it, and you should try offering something else. Due to their stubby legs and being specifically adapted to not climbing, Acromyrmex versicolor is by far the easiest highest Attine to contain. A simple fluon barrier should be more than adequate to contain this species, as long as it's done well. I would recommend not using a lid, or if you do, make sure it has great ventilation, so that the colony can dry out their food more quickly. This species doesn't require any sort of special trash chamber. Similarly to the other higher Attines, they'll simply create a dump pile in the foraging area. Of course, since this species makes much larger colonies, up to 50,000 workers on a single queen, roughly, they'll produce significantly more waste. Because of this, a much larger foraging area and more regular cleaning is recommended. Despite decades of collective experience with this species, Acromyrmex versicolor will often puzzle ant keepers with some strange behaviors that aren't seen in many other fungus growers. Most notably, some colonies will randomly see a rapid shrinking of their fungus before it stabilizes and grows back. This doesn't seem to be a diapause behavior like seen in Trachymyrmex, but as of right now, I'm not aware of any information on why this happens in captivity. It's possible we're missing some key aspect of their care, but after decades of experience from American ant keepers and myself keeping this species dozens of times in 4 years, I haven't figured it out. For now, we know it's relatively normal and may not affect all colonies. In fact, I've never personally encountered this phenomenon. That said, if you notice your colony's fungus shrinking, make sure they're still cutting plants and feeding the fungus, as well as to be sure that the setup is not too dry or too wet. If you're noticing this fungus shrinking behavior, it's also definitely worth switching up the colony's diet, as a plant you're collecting for them may have been treated with an insecticide or a fungicide, and this could be explaining the rapid fungus shrinking. With the special case of Acromyrmex versicolor out of the way, it's time to focus on the other highest Attines. If you skip straight to this part, first of all, shame on you. Second of all, you should really go watch from the beginning of this video, because you'll be starting out your colony in a very similar way to keeping a colony of the other higher Attine species. And I'm not going over the same information again. Also, if I can just go off script for a second here, this video has been a tremendous undertaking of work for me. I mean, I started writing this script a year ago, and I've been editing this video for over a week straight, and as I'm recording this, I'm only halfway done. I mean, this has been a ton of effort for, like I said, over a year of filming, writing the script, getting all this information over the past 4 years. And so I'm not going to ask you to subscribe because, well, I'm really not going to be making other long guide videos like this. So before you go into the comments, or for those of you that have already left a comment asking for more guides, don't expect them. But what I would appreciate is if you went and checked out some of my other videos, and if you like those videos, then consider subscribing. Okay, enough YouTuber spiel. Let's get back into actually, figuring out how to keep these ants. Once your colony has between 15 and 30 workers, which should be 1 generation for Atta and 2 to 3 generations for Acromyrmex and Acromyrmex, they'll be ready to move into their first real setup. Now, for Acromyrmex and Acromyrmex, you could technically found your queens in a larger setup than the deli cups we talked about earlier. But when collecting a large number of queens, it can get really expensive to make a lot of fancy setups just for founding. That said, it may be a decent idea to use a larger setup for founding Atta Texana, as multiple Atta queens working together will raise a larger fungus garden, more nanotics, and several massive ant queens will require more space. If you choose to use a deli cup, make sure it's a large one. But if not, using a larger, proper setup can be a good idea. Anyways, after your queen has her first few dozen workers, a setup with a capacity of 1/2 to 1 liter is ideal for the early stages. A setup like I detailed for the smaller higher Attine species will work perfectly for this situation, so again, if you skipped that section, go back to get the details that you'll need. With your colony in a basic starter setup, consisting of around 1 liter of nesting space and a small foraging area, care should be as simple as maintaining humidity in the chamber and offering a variety of plants and other food items. For Acromyrmex and Acromyrmex, you should have a decent idea of what your colony's eating from founding, since you had to feed your queen during that stage. Although, if you purchase a pre-established colony, either get information about their preferred diet from your seller, or have a large variety of plants ready to experiment with. As I've mentioned previously, items like rose petals, romaine lettuce, oats, and cornmeal can be consistent, easy to acquire food options for fungus-growing ants, although you should try to diversify as much as possible. With Acromyrmex and Atta volunweederi, Capiguara, Guyana, and Bispherica, grasses make up a significant portion of their natural diet, and will likely be preferred over almost all other plants. Atta laevigata and sextans are also highly generalistic and may include grasses in their diet, but will primarily take a traditional flower and leaf diet. Other Atta species are likely to refuse grasses and other monocots entirely. As briefly mentioned previously, oftentimes if a leafcutter ant colony is fed the same food item over and over, they will start to reject it, so a diverse diet is often quite important. This quirk is much less noticeable with other higher Attines, and especially lower Attines, but many of the highest Attines have a built-in instinct to not over-harvest a single plant species, as it's in their best interest to let a given plant in their territory have some time to recover so they can continue to harvest from it in the future. This means that without offering variation, your ants may begin to reject food for the purpose of preserving whatever plant they've been consistently harvesting. This quirk will become more noticeable as the colony grows, but it will also be easier to manage. Young colonies will often have stricter preferences, taking in a much narrower variety of foods. As they grow and their demand for food increases, they will begin accepting a much wider variety. Because of this, if your colony rejects a food once, it's wise to try offering it again in a few months down the line, just to see if their tastes have adjusted. One final tip is to keep an eye on the ant's fungus waste. The color and texture of the waste fungus will reflect the health of the colony's fungus pretty accurately, and can act as a great indicator on whether or not the ant's current diet is ideal or not. You should ideally see the waste fungus being a dark, earthy brown color. This indicates that the fungus is receiving optimal nutrients and is likely growing well. If the waste fungus is instead a lighter brown color with a straw-like consistency, it's a likely indicator that the diet is not quite as nutrient-dense, and the ants may be growing a lower quality fungus. This is not to say that the colony's dying, as colonies can certainly grow on a less than ideal diet, but if you have the ability to experiment with new food items, it may be worth introducing more variety into the diet to provide more optimal nutrients to the fungus. During the stage of your colony's life just after founding, often called the incipient stage, things will be pretty simple. A small foraging area with a simple barrier should easily keep your colony contained, for now. The only consideration at this point should be trash disposal. During the incipient stage, there won't be a ton of trash generated, but you should pay close attention to where it's being dumped. Atta mexicana, columbica, and sometimes cephalotes create above-ground waste dumps in the wild. Other species will often or exclusively create subterranean dumps for dead fungus and workers. Having a surface dump means that the ants will choose to exit the nest to dump waste, which is a huge advantage in captivity. For species that dump below ground, they will often choose to dump waste in a sealed chamber. So for these Atta species, a sealed chamber designated for trash will likely be required. This chamber can be a completely plain container, and shouldn't have any plaster or moisture-absorbing material. It can also have a small amount of ventilation to discourage ants from trying to build live fungus in the chamber, but make sure not to over-ventilate it, as this can discourage the ants from dumping waste there. The waste dumping tendencies of many Atta, Acromyrmex, and Ammoymyrmex species are not particularly well known, especially in captivity, so monitor your colony for where they're choosing to place their trash. If your colony is storing trash inside the nest, typically choosing an isolated corner of the container in the incipient stage, a sealed waste chamber is likely a necessity. If they're dumping in the outworld, then an open-air trash chamber will be best. When the colony is small, they will only need one outworld for both dumping and foraging, assuming that they're not dumping inside the nest. Once you've got your colony's trash habits and diet figured out, it should be pretty smooth sailing for the next little while. Depending on how much you feed your colony, they may be ready for a setup upgrade as soon as 1 to 2 months after being placed in this starter setup. That said, growth on fungus growers is also insanely easy to control, and as such they could remain in this starter setup theoretically indefinitely. Queens lay eggs based on the volume of fungus the colony has, and if you offer just enough plant material to maintain the current fungus size without growing it, then it's very easy to keep your colony the exact same size indefinitely with no issues. This is true for any size colony, whether you want to limit them at 1,000, 10,000, or 500,000 workers, although there are a few things to know if you plan to limit your colonies at a massive size. Ultimately, since all Atta species are able to maintain colonies of well over 1 million workers, you will inevitably need to limit your colony's size. And if you choose to do so at a relatively large number of workers, there are some factors to consider that I'll get into in a bit. For now, once your colony has filled their starter setup and has around 1/2 to 1 liter of fungus, they'll be ready for a more permanent setup. For this, the basic formula for a nesting chamber remains the same. A nice acrylic container with plaster and a way to hydrate it. However, there are certain things to consider, such as ideal dimensions and expandability. You'll also need to start thinking about major upgrades for your colony's foraging space. Starting with the nesting space, we'll need to pick a container. Here there are a lot of options, but there are 2 key restrictions that you'll need to consider. The first restriction is height. As leafcutter ant fungus grows upwards, it also becomes much heavier, compressing the fungus on the bottom, eventually becoming too heavy to support. I've found that approximately 10 inches is the upper limit for how tall a fungus garden can grow, so try to keep your maximum chamber size around this height. Personally, I have found 8 inches, or around 20 centimeters, to be an ideal height. The second restriction is volume. While a mature Atta colony will have hundreds and hundreds of liters of fungus, it's not all kept in one massive chamber. While fungus chambers can get quite large naturally, I would never ever suggest going above 10 liters for a single chamber, and likely much smaller for Acromyrmex and Acromyrmex. For Atta, I typically prefer keeping my fungus chambers between 2 and 6 liters. Chambers smaller than this size become impractical, as a large colony will fill chambers of this size in no time after they're attached. And larger chambers will have the exact opposite problem, taking long enough to fill up with fungus that the ants will likely be unsanitary and store trash here temporarily. This is typically a non-issue, as the fungus grows, the ants will remove any trash from the chamber. But I personally strongly dislike the transitional period where both live fungus and trash are stored together, as storing trash alongside live fungus has the potential to cause problems. This fact is exactly why the species that dump fungus below ground can be problematic in captivity. They're more likely to store waste alongside healthy fungus, which has the potential to kill off entire chambers of healthy fungus if left unmanaged. When they have the instinct to remove waste from the nest, it makes the fungus chambers much more cleanly as a whole. Anyhow, for Atta, as long as your container fits into those metrics of less than 10 inches in height and less than 10 liters of size, you'll be pretty well set. For an Acromyrmex colony, you may well want to reduce those dimensions more, and especially so for Acromyrmex, which create smaller colonies. A fully grown Acromyrmex colony will likely not grow more than 10 liters of fungus total, and I would personally recommend splitting this up into several smaller chambers, although it likely will not be detrimental for the colony to grow one massive fungus garden, as several species of Acromyrmex have been shown to do this in the wild. Acromyrmex, with smaller colonies than Acromyrmex, will likely be able to fit a full-size colony in 5 to 8 liters, which could very easily be contained in 1 or maybe 2 large chambers. For both of these genera, I would recommend a slightly shorter chamber, with 8 inches tall being the absolute maximum. And as I said, there are plenty of options for containers to use. While I'm not as familiar with what containers are available outside the US, I do have some suggestions for US keepers. Target's Bright Room brand has storage containers that work great for fungus growers. The smallest container, the 2.75C, has a capacity of 1 liter, and is great for smaller leafcutter ant colonies. The 5.8C and 12.6C have a capacity of 2 and 4 liters respectively, and work great as fungus chambers for large colonies. These are great options, as they're widely available in nationwide brick-and-mortar stores, meaning no waiting for online shipments. That said, if you'd like something with a clear lid, or just more options, Pioneer Plastic's 280C is a great 2-liter option. Their 289C is a large 6-liter container that's toward the upper limit for acceptable sizes, but works great and is very cost-efficient for the space. Pioneer Plastic's 083C container also has a roughly 2-liter capacity, but sits horizontally, giving a different but totally acceptable form factor. As you can tell, there's a wide variety of options, so feel free to get creative, as long as you're staying within the space requirements. Once you have your container picked out, you'll need to move your colony. Personally, I found the easiest way to just be picking up the fungus and moving it. Coming from your starter setup, the fungus should be the perfect size to pick up and move in just one handful. Just be careful not to injure the queen during this process. And it also helps to have an aspirator handy, as you'll inevitably end up needing to clean up a lot of angry workers. As the colony grows, they'll begin looking to forage much further, collecting dramatically increased amounts of food. In the wild, these large colonies will be constantly bringing in plant material for hours upon hours each day, and it's rare that those conditions will be able to be met in captivity. This means that they'll constantly be foraging for food, and if they can't find any, they'll look to forage further and further from the nest. This means that they'll become rather persistent at escaping in search of more food and more foraging space. While you may be able to provide larger outworlds and more foraging space, eventually they will need to be limited, and you need to be prepared for this eventuality. On top of this persistent escaping behavior, leafcutter ants are also extremely adept climbers. These ants have long legs and a strong grip that they use to climb high into treetop canopies to harvest leaves, and as such, they typically make short work of ant barriers. The best solution that I've found to this is to have an upside-down lip, with a layer of fluon applied to the underside. When the barrier is upside down instead of vertical on the container, it becomes significantly more difficult for the ants to get a grip, and they'll wear down the barrier significantly slower. A large, persistent Atta colony can wear down a well-applied fluon barrier in as little as 3 days, but an upside-down barrier will last significantly longer, often lasting for several weeks or months of constant pressure before needing to be replaced. Now, of course, some of you might be asking, why can't I just use a lid? While it's true that a lid would work flawlessly to keep Atta contained, it's also a horrible idea for several reasons. For one, anytime the lid needed to be removed to add food and removed unused branches, dry leaves, trash, and more, hundreds of workers would flood out of the container, which is obviously not ideal. The second and much more important reason is that the highest Attines absolutely need ventilation. Every time a piece of leaf is brought inside the nest, it brings with it a level of moisture. While it may be a relatively insignificant amount, when a colony is harvesting large numbers of plants, it adds up, and eventually there will be enough moisture entering the nest through plants alone to keep the humidity at ideal levels. A side note here is that if you live somewhere with harsh winters and resort to feeding your ants more dried food during the winter, they'll no longer be intaking moisture via the food, and their diet should either be supplemented with food that has a high water content, like iceberg lettuce, or the nest should be directly hydrated. Anyhow, considering this fact, without proper ventilation, the setup will have no way to release excess moisture, and eventually will become oversaturated, flooding the chamber and killing the fungus. The fact that the ants are constantly bringing in moisture with their food is great. It means that after a certain point, as long as you're feeding the colony fresh plants consistently, you'll never have to moisten the setup ever again. The only requirement is that you must also have an open foraging area. Even a solid lid with mesh ventilation will not be enough. They need a significant amount of airflow to balance humidity inside the nest. While you can add very small ventilation holes to the nesting chambers, I do generally advise against this, as it can be easy to accidentally add too much ventilation directly to the nest, which can make fluctuations in humidity hard to control. Generally, you'll see the best results with a sealed nest chamber and an open foraging area. If you still notice your colony setup becoming oversaturated, it's likely a good idea to increase the diameter of the tubing connecting the nest and foraging area together, to allow for a higher volume of air to pass through. So, an open outworld is important. But how do you create an upside-down barrier while keeping the foraging area open? This can be achieved in a number of ways. My personal favorite is to use a Dremel or other cutting tool to simply cut a square out of the middle of a container lid, leaving a roughly 1-inch lip around the rim of the container. Pioneer Plastics has a great series for this, as the containers have a raised ridge on top that acts as a perfect guide for cutting. Cutting out the center square of plastic will create a perfect lip to apply an upside-down barrier to. Using a container's lid also has the advantage of being swappable. If you purchase more than one container, you can use additional lids as extra lips. When the barrier on one lip begins to fail, you can quickly swap a new lip with a fresh barrier on, replacing the barrier quickly without having to wipe old fluon off with ants still inside the outworld. An alternative to this would be to use acrylic sheets to create a custom lip around the top of any old container. This may not be quite as convenient, but it does allow you to use even larger foraging areas, as even the large 395C container isn't huge, and can become cramped for a large Atta colony. Now that you have your nest, foraging area, waste disposal, and diet figured out, most of the work is done. At this point, all that needs to be done is future expansions for the colony as they continue to grow. The main nesting chamber they're using right now can be used for many years, and as they demand additional nesting space, more chambers can be simply added, as long as they follow the size rules I laid out before. Once this happens, additional foraging space will also likely become a necessity. This is also the point where surface dumping species should almost certainly have a designated trash outworld. There isn't really a problem with the ants foraging and dumping in the same space. However, not only is it unnatural, as these species will create separate foraging tunnels to collect plants far away from their dump site, but also a large colony will be creating enough waste that it'll likely build up quickly and limit the space for placing food inside the outworld. Overall, I just personally always feel it's right to have a separate dump site for larger colonies. Of course, if your colony isn't dumping in the foraging area, you should absolutely have a designated trash chamber by now, to prevent the ants from storing trash inside healthy nest chambers. If you are noticing this behavior, especially in a species that typically dumps above ground, check the moisture levels of the nesting chambers. Sometimes colonies will store dry trash in oversaturated nest chambers in an attempt to soak up excess moisture. This is not good, both because it likely means your chamber is flooded and killing the fungus, but also because the waste can be unsanitary and introduce disease and foreign fungi to the colony, threatening the health of the fungus. All the more reason to make sure your colony has a proper setup with proper trash disposal sites. As you add additional nesting sites, you can start doing some really fun stuff with these setups. Whether it's creating long, extensive tubes between the nest and foraging areas, or a rope bridge for the ants to forage across, at this point, your imagination is the only limit. Well, that and the basics that we discussed before. At no point should you disregard the outlines mentioned previously. Keep your chamber heights in check, keep your chamber volumes in check, make sure your outworlds are properly ventilated, and make sure that trash is going where it's supposed to. And keeping leafcutter ants should be a breeze. That said, I do have one final tip if things aren't going quite to plan. If you notice your colony's fungus slowly shrinking for seemingly no reason, and you've tried adjusting the diet and humidity with little change, one final tip that can help is to offer the ants a source of both sugar water and drinking water. Technically, there's no reason not to do this, but it does add another level of maintenance that is generally unnecessary, so I typically don't do this unless it seems necessary. That said, I currently do this for an Atta mexicana colony that is particularly picky with their food choices. When sugar water is offered to the workers, it reduces the rate at which the fungus is consumed, since the workers are able to get sustenance from elsewhere. Typically, the workers get a large portion of their sugars from drinking sap from the leaves as they cut them, but especially if the colony is intaking mostly dried food items, it can be a good idea to offer some sugars. I usually just place a test tube setup full of both sugar water and drinking water inside the foraging area, replacing them when the levels of liquid get low. Assuming nothing else is going wrong, this small adjustment can result in significant health improvements for the colony. Now that we've got the higher Attines out of the way, it's time for the lower Attines. This curious group of ants are much more rarely kept for a few reasons. They have little diversity in the United States, they can be more difficult to catch due to smaller nuptial flights, and often have more difficult care than their higher Attine counterparts. That said, these ants are still really cool, and are generally still able to be kept in captivity. While I personally have only kept a handful of lower Attines, I do have a good amount of experience with these ants in the wild, and have spoken with keepers and labs that have colonies of these species, so I still have a decent amount of good information to share about these ants. With lower Attines, there's two very meaningful distinctions. The majority of lower Attines grow a relatively normal mycelium fungus, just like every other fungus grower. The exception here is a number of Cyphomyrmex species, which instead grow a yeast. The mycelium growers will generally have a similar care regimen to the smaller higher Attines, as they grow a relatively similar fungus. The yeast growers, on the other hand, are a much different story, and honestly, I generally don't recommend keeping these ants at all. Still, I'll go over some of their biology for those willing to take on the challenge. As a generalization, the lower Attines reach small colony sizes and have small workers, rarely ever exceeding over a few hundred workers at maximum size. For creating your lower Attine setup, we'll be using many of the methods from the higher Attine setups we created earlier. For Cyphomyrmex, both the mycelium and yeast growers, a low chamber height is ideal. The setup for a mature colony will end up looking nearly identical to that of a founding Acromyrmex versicolor colony. For these Cyphomyrmex species, a nest of about 8 by 8 centimeters with a chamber depth of around 2 to 2.5 centimeters, or a volume of around 130 to 160 cubic centimeters, will be about as much space as a mature colony will use. This nest, combined with a small foraging area for collecting food and disposing of waste, will work perfectly. Remember, for these guys the nests will need to be consistently hydrated, so ensure your nest has a hydration method like those detailed prior in the guide. The yeast-growing Cyphomyrmex will also nest in a similar setting, creating narrow galleries in humid chambers within rotting logs or under stones, so this same type of setup will work for them. Other non-Cyphomyrmex lower Attines that grow mycelium may also benefit from a thinner chamber height. These species create more typical shaped chambers underground, although given the generally small size of these ants and their colonies, these chambers are often small and thin. They also regularly hang their fungus from roots and branches underground, so a low ceiling in captivity can help facilitate this behavior similarly to Acromyrmex versicolor. Our final special case within the lower Attines is the most basal fungus grower genus, a paleoattine known as Apterostigma. These species generally grow to a maximum colony size of only a few dozen workers, although some larger species can actually have rather large workers and may be able to sustain a colony of around 100 workers. However, the small colony size is not the main interest with these ants. Rather, the unique trait held by many members of this genus is their open-air nesting. These ants live deep in the rainforests of the neotropics, where air humidity is high enough for fungus growth year-round. This means that many of these species grow their fungus on the sides of trees or the undersides of fallen logs, completely open to the air. While this behavior is extremely interesting, for captivity it likely only means that the chamber they're held in should have some way to facilitate hanging their fungus from the ceiling or a wall. I'm unsure if their fungus is able to stick to smooth acrylic like the fungus of Acromyrmex versicolor, so using sandpaper to scuff up the acrylic may help these primitive ants grow good fungus. Finally, when it comes to keeping these ants contained, a relatively simple barrier or lid will be effective. For the vast majority of lower Attines, stubby legs facilitate exclusively terrestrial foraging, meaning that their climbing abilities are weak. Small workers will also forage in a small radius from their nest, meaning not much foraging space is required. These species will generally dump the small amount of waste they produce inside their foraging area with little fuss, making cleaning easy. While their general nesting preferences don't seem generally difficult for most species, lower Attine diet can be the biggest obstacle to keeping them. Unlike the higher Attines, seeing these species consuming fresh plant material is rare. These species will commonly be seen eating insect frass in the wild, although their diet is not necessarily exclusive to this. In captivity, I have had great success feeding Cyphomyrmex wheeleri, a mycelium grower, a diet of exclusively steel-cut oats and the frass of oak-eating caterpillars. Other keepers have had success feeding Cyphomyrmex wheeleri a variety of fresh flowers as well. I assert that a similar diet of oats and frass will be sustainable for a large majority of lower Attines. Going along with the theme, an interesting quirk coming from the yeast-growing Cyphomyrmex is in their diet. These ants have been observed collecting insect exoskeleton parts to feed to their yeast, a stark contrast compared to the vegetarian diets of every other Attina. That said, I've also observed the yeast-growing Cyphomyrmex salvini foraging on flowers in the wild, suggesting that the yeast growers may have an incredibly varied diet. Still, it generally seems as though the lower Attines have a preference for dried and processed foods. This can be a benefit, as large quantities of these foods can be placed in the foraging area for the ants to collect as they see fit. As long as the foraging area is kept dry and well ventilated to prevent the food from spoiling, this can mean that colonies can have weeks of stored up food in their foraging area for them to slowly collect over time. When I kept a large Cyphomyrmex wheeleri colony, I was able to go months between feedings by stockpiling large amounts of potential food items in the foraging area, meaning that the only care the colony required was occasional watering. It is absolutely worth mentioning that Cyphomyrmex wheeleri is the only lower Attine I have extensive captive experience with. However, I've spoken with others who've kept Apterostigma and other mycelium Cyphomyrmex, and they've detailed extremely similar captive conditions as I provided for my wheeleri. I suggest that most mycelium-growing lower Attines can be kept with very similar methods. I wish that I had more comments on this diverse group of ants, particularly the yeast-growing Cyphomyrmex, but with how rarely these ants are successfully kept, it's difficult to get reliable information on most of them. Still, I hope that this short section, as well as having a general understanding of the higher Attines care, can help keepers to slowly figure out more specific for the care of the lower Attines. And well, that's just about every last bit of information that I can think to include. Over the years, the fungus growing ants that I've had the pleasure of keeping have easily topped the list as the most fun and rewarding species of ants that I've kept thus far. And I hope that this video can serve as a guide for many years to come to spread the joy of keeping these ants far and wide. If you're one of the few that's still here and you're looking for more content about fungus growing ants, here's a couple videos for you to check out after this. I definitely want to thank everyone for your support on this video. This has been the result of a massive passion project, and I'm so glad to finally bring it to light. Anyways, that's enough from me. Thank you so very much for watching, and I wish you all great luck on your ant keeping adventures.